Hello and welcome to another Retfurb video. Today we're looking at a set of Cannondale Fatty forks that we're going to strip down, re-grease, rebuild, put it all back together and just show the process involved. So you can see underneath the fork there's a small circlip which, if you take this part out, there's a small little plug which comes out and then you can release the elastomer or the spring that's in there. Now this doesn't actually need to be removed to do what we're doing today. This is one of the special tools that need to be used to remove some of the parts on the fork. This is a part tool SPA1. So I've actually loosened a lot of the parts on this already just to make it easier, just to make it quicker to show the process, but you'll still see what's involved to do all this. First thing to do is get the pin tool and just release the top nut, and then this will allow access to the inside. Now I did actually start showing this process on another video, but unfortunately when it came to doing the actual greasing part and looking inside there was too much rust, so it couldn't go any further. So with this video it will show the process of stripping down and refitting all in one. So now if you look down the steerer tube you can see there's another part that needs to be undone. This requires a special tool, however the two that I've done both could be undone with long nose pliers. Obviously when you do this you've got to be extremely careful not to slip and cause any damage, so if you're unsure I would recommend the proper tool. This again was loosened prior to doing this, so if it looks like it's even easier it's because I loosened it before setting it back up to show how it's done. Now once this part's unscrewed, you can then pull it out. This is the cartridge damping unit. We're not actually going to get into servicing this part on this video, but it can be unscrewed and the oil can be replaced. This one is in good condition, is moving fine, so I don't think it actually needs it. So if you hadn't already noticed, this fork's got a few bits in it which shouldn't actually be in here. The cartridge is out of a DD50 model, and the spring and the elastomer I think is out of another fork. I'm pretty sure originally this fork was an air operated one. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure it was. So at some point it's had a modification to have a spring and elastomer in it. The DD50 I think was an upgrade. This cartridge from the DD50 was an upgrade on the one that was originally in here, because this is an early Fatty 50 fork. Anyway, back to stripping it down. So with this part you now need the pin tool again to undo this, and then you'll be able to get the outer tube sleeve off. This then gives access to the inner bearings and the bearing faces. So at this point it's a good idea to mark the front of the tube, just so you know which way you can put it back on. Obviously you want to try and get the bearings back in the same spots that they came out of. So at this point it's quite a good idea to wrap something around the bearing faces, just in case it all falls apart and then you don't know which one went with which. I'm just using a rubber band here just to wrap it around there. To be honest, it probably won't fall off on its own, but just to be on the safe side it's best to do this. You can see the bearing races are a lot better condition than the other ones that I did. The other ones were immediately rusty as soon as we got to this point. You could see it. These ones are nice and clean, so they've obviously been well looked after. Now as I'm removing the bearings I'm just trying to lay them out so I remember which way they go. It just makes it easier when assembling. Now the rubber band can be removed and then the bearing races can come off. Again, it's important to remember the orientation of these so they're facing the right way, inner and outer, and in the right position. Judging by the condition of these, I would say they were serviced not that long ago, or they haven't been used much since. They don't look like they got much wear at all on them. Obviously you want to be looking for any kind of rust on the surface, any kind of pitting, also along the edges. Whether it's worn down, you'll find a ridge, and this is a good indication whether they need replacing or not. So all the parts now need wiping down, cleaned, degreased, and then re-greased, and then they can be put back onto the fork. So I'm just using a multi-purpose grease here, which is ideal for these sort of bearings. I'm just going to put it on all faces of all the bearings and all the races. So when you're putting these back on, you need to make sure that the top of the race just lines up with the top of the fork, otherwise you'll have issues when you come to putting it back together. The repair manual also stipulates this. So now fast forwarding to all the racers being greased and refitted, we can now go on to the bearings. Firstly, we just need to put on the lower rubber O-ring. And again, just to secure the bearing racers in place, we'll just put the rubber band back on and make sure the racers meet the top of the tube. Now we can start cleaning the bearings, so I'm just going to wipe off all the old grease, and then I'm going to get some degreaser and then re-grease them. So when we start assembling these back onto the tube, the manual says to use old inner tube to hold it in place. So I've got some old inner tube that I'm just going to cut into strips, and then we can use that to hold these bearings in place while we push the tube back over. So now you can see here I'm just wiping the grease in all the bearings, just making sure to get it in as best as I can. Then once I've done this, I'll then put it on the tube and then I can secure it in place. The manual says that there should be 11 bearings showing above the top of the tube. So this did work out okay, but you might have to move it a couple of times. I found that when I did it the first time, it didn't quite line up correct. It was sort of stuck up too high. But once I adjusted them, it worked out okay. It's just a matter of tweaking it a mil or two and then you'll be able to get it in the right location. Here you can see that I'm just securing it with the elastic band, but I will be replacing this with the rubber from the inner tube. So now onto the outer sleeve, we just need to remove the racers from that and then do exactly the same with them. Clean the inside of the tube, degrease it, clean all the racers, re-grease them and put it back together. Again, the condition of these looks pretty good. The top there's some brown staining, but you'll see that when I start wiping it off with the degreaser, this all comes off. Now to clean the inside of the tube, and then we can degrease it and get it ready to put it all back together. And then again, to clean these and get them ready also. And don't forget to check for any wear whilst you're doing it. You can see there the brown staining has come off quite easily. So that's all the outer sleeve racers now cleaned. They can start being greased and then we can get them back into the tube. Applying grease to all surfaces again. This will also hold the race in place whilst we're fitting it back up together. Now the manual does recommend that you use another part of the inner tube just to blow it up inside this part of the tube. So once you slide it all back together, it's supposed to hold it in place. I don't actually do that and I don't think you actually really need to do it. It does make it easier. It took me probably 3 attempts to get it on there. Maybe with the recommended inner tube way of doing it, you might be able to do it first time. But I think if you're careful and just slide it on gradually and you make sure that all the bearings are staying in place while you're doing it, you should be fine. So when these racers go back in, they just need to be lined up with the bottom of the tube. Now that's the outer tube done with all the racers back in place and all greased up. Here I'm just making sure that I've got 11 individual bearings above the top of the tube because this is how it shows you to do it. You can also see now the inner tube part is now over the bearings to hold them in place. I'm now going to line up the front of the outer sleeve and then put it over the bearings and then we can get it lined up and slid back on. As you're doing this, just need to make sure that those inner bearings just stay in place and don't move. If they start to move, they need to reset. And when I say move, I mean they move at a different rate. So if one moves more than the rest, then they're out of sync. And you need to make sure that as you slide it on, they all move at the same amount. Now this wasn't the first time that I did this. I did this about 3 times like I said before, and this is the time that I managed to get it lined up okay. It wasn't that it was far out, it just meant that one of the bearings was slightly out of place. And to be honest, I think you'd get this even if you did blow up an inner tube inside the outer sleeve. I think that you always run the risk that those bearings will just move slightly more as you're sliding it on. So now I'm putting the lower lock ring back in place, just screwing this on, then I can make sure that the bearings are going up to the right level inside the tube. So at the highest position, when you look down inside the tube, the inner bearings shouldn't go above the inner part of the fork steerer tube. Hopefully you can see what I sort of mean when you look down inside the tube. You'll see the top part of the plastic bit holding the roller bearings doesn't go above that inner part. So now we can secure the lower lock ring with the pin tool. I'm not actually sure if this is necessary or not, but I'm just going to put a little bit of grease on this part of the cartridge. We can then start getting the inner parts put back in and getting it all put back together. So now to put the elastomer back inside the spring, and then we can slide the spring back in, and then the cartridge will go back in above that. Make sure when you slide the oil cartridge back in that you make sure that it's in the lowest position, because then it will make it easier to get it screwed back in. Again, it's recommended to use the correct tool to do this part up, but I'm actually using long nose pliers. I found it all okay. I can get it secure enough like this. As long as you're careful, you'll be fine. Now that the inner cartridge is in place and that's all secure, you can look at securing the upper part. This again requires a special pin tool to lock this in place. And that's it. One last final thing to do is to put the rubber boot back on. I'm not actually going to secure this because I plan to paint these forks at some point, but I'll just put it on to show you the process. So with the rubber boot, the smaller diameter part goes on the bottom and the larger goes on the upper part of the fork. And that's it, all completed. Thanks again for taking the time to watch the video, it's appreciated. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.